So when I tell people that there was an alleged cult on Mackinac Island, usually their immediate answer is, "Sir, please stop disturbing the commoners at the Antiques Roadshow." Most Michiganders, and really most Americans, have no idea that an alleged right-wing Christian cult with over 1 million followers once descended upon the U.S. in the middle of the 20th century, spreading right-wing Christian nationalism all over America before building their U.S. headquarters on Mackinac Island. And those headquarters are now the modern-day Mission Point Resort, and the name of that alleged cult was Moral Re-Armament. Many people believe Mission Point Resort is haunted by a ghost named Harvey the Ghost, based upon a tale of a Mackinac College student named Harvey, who apparently jumped off the cliff next to the resort. As I mentioned in the first part of this video, that tale is a lie, and later in this video I will reveal his real name and story. To understand how Moral Re-Armament and Mission Point Resort came to be, you really have to look into the life of Frank Buchman. Frank Buchman was born in 1878 to a family of Swiss descent in the farming community of Pennsburg, Pennsylvania. Buchman's mom, Sarah, was rigidly Lutheran, and this had a large effect on Frank in his childhood. The Buchman family would eventually move to Allentown, Pennsylvania, where Frank would graduate high school and college. He'd then go to Mount Airy Lutheran Seminary in Philadelphia before he became a Lutheran minister in June of 1902. After preaching in Philadelphia and going on travels in Europe, Buchman became a YMCA secretary at Penn State in 1909, and it was here that Buchman started to encourage his pupils to have quiet time every day, in which they had to reflect on their sins and let the Holy Spirit guide them. After a few years, his charismatic ways increased the YMCA membership at Penn State by 75%. And people were so impressed within the YMCA that they sent him to India to meet Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi's grandson, Rajmohan Gandhi, would eventually become a member of Frank's movement. Buchman then moved to Hartford, Connecticut, and worked at the Hartford Theological Seminary. During this period, he visited China many times to do missionary work, and it was here that Buchman developed the 5 C's, which were confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. He apparently ruffled many feathers in China's Christian missionary movement, accusing some of homosexuality, and by 1918, Bishop Logan Roots asked Buchman to leave China. After he left China, Buchman then started the First Century Christian Fellowship, which gave him his own group to preach his thoughts on how to lead a better life and be closer to God. Armed with a game plan, Buchman started to travel to colleges, inviting young students to house parties, where he'd preach his thoughts on Christianity and allegedly invite students to confess sins of immorality, including sexual sins. Buchman's disturbances of campus life actually got him expelled from Princeton University in 1924, with Princeton president John Hibben saying, "There's no place for Buchmanism in Princeton." Eventually, Frank found himself in Oxford, England at Oxford University, where his fellowship began to greatly increase in size, and it was here that his group allegedly adopted the odd practice of holding hands in a circle on campus and confessing their sins in public, according to local newspapers at the time. Others would later dispute the hand-holding and public confessions, but nonetheless, Buchman's movement was growing and causing a stir on the Oxford campus. He again preached to students the need for quiet time and encouraged them to partake in a 6-fold test of self-reflection and to strive for 4 absolutes that included absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. Some critics said that the total honesty clause of the Oxford group went too far, exclaiming that Buchman enjoyed focusing on sexual issues far too much, in particular, masturbation in young men. Other critics would say that Buchman's 4 absolutes were impossible to attain, and that it left its members in a constant spiral of trying to achieve a perfection of self that could never be reached. As the group started to grow and travel to other areas around the globe, the press donned this fellowship as the Oxford Group. Buchman also said that to truly complete the experience of the Oxford Group, one must convert someone else into following the same path. Buchman called this soul surgery. It is important to note, though, that as Buchman enlisted people to spread the word of the Oxford Group, he paid them no salary. And this practice of hiring volunteer workers would continue for the rest of his life. Frank began to open up the Oxford group to more religions than Christianity, but often still focused on relinquishing oneself to God, whatever the God of your religion may be. And he truly thought that if individuals started participating in quiet time and following his 5 C's and 4 absolutes, that the Oxford group could solve all the world's problems and lead to great diplomacy amongst all countries. Several times in 1932 and 1933, Buchman even tried to meet with a burgeoning head of state in Germany named Adolf Hitler. But Hitler did not want Christianity to be a main part of his National Socialist state, even saying that Christianity was a Jewish invention meant to destroy Aryans. Hitler was also worried that a movement such as the Oxford Group could be a rival to his fascist takeover. And in fact, in 1939, a document was made by the German SS saying if the German forces took London, they should seize the Oxford Group headquarters. Buchman was also extremely anti-communist, as he thought that it focused too much on materialism and was anti-God. He thought that Christianity would be a good tool to eradicate communism. Hitler's paranoia over the Oxford Group did not stop Frank Buchman from commenting on and even praising Hitler in 1936. Buchman did not see him as an all-around bad guy, even saying such things that I will not read out loud as I don't want to get kicked off YouTube. Buchman would later say that his comments were taken out of context, and that he was only happy Hitler had eradicated communism from Germany, but he also came out in support of a fascist, theocratic country, saying, quote, "Spain has taught us what godless communism will bring. Human problems aren't economic, they are moral, and they can't be solved by immoral measures. They could be solved within a God-controlled democracy, or perhaps I should say, a theocracy, and they could be solved through a God-controlled fascist dictatorship," unquote. In 1935, 2 members of the Oxford Group named Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith started using the practices of the Oxford Group and applying them towards overcoming the addiction of alcohol. And these meetings and subsequent larger meetings with helping others treat alcoholism led to Bill Wilson writing a book in 1939 called Alcoholics Anonymous, The Story and How More Than 100 Men Have Recovered from Alcoholism. This established the 12-step program, which was heavily inspired by the practices of the Oxford Group, but placed more focus on group therapy. So one could say that Buchmanism directly inspired Alcoholics Anonymous.
Cease Broadhurst from the Canadian prairies sings out the philosophy of MRA. Shall we see nations free on the march for God? Shall we see diplomats agree to changing lives in every nation? Shall we see harmony at the office and the fireside? We'll see it, yes, but it must start with you and me.
By 1938, a Swedish man named Harry Bloomberg, who was part of the Oxford Group, wrote a report on how the world needed to rearm morally as tensions with Germany were growing. Buchman liked the phrasing of rearm morally so much that he officially renamed the Oxford Group to Moral Re-Armament in 1938. And by 1941, the MRA had set up shop in the United States. As the world descended into World War II, Moral Re-Armament had the cunning idea to delve into show business to convey their message. And this resulted in the group creating a play called You Can Defend America, which was based on an MRA booklet. It ended up touring 21 states, and the movement was big enough for Franklin D. Roosevelt to compliment it on its contribution to the morale of America, calling for sound homes, teamwork in industry, and a united nation. The Michigan governor at the time, Murray Van Wagoner, was so fond of the MRA movement that according to an MRA superintendent named W.P. Stubbs, Van Wagoner invited the group to Mackinac Island. And so the MRA was first introduced to Mackinac Island in the summer of 1942. This Lansing State Journal article on April 17, 1942 is the first article I can find of a newspaper mentioning moral rearmament on Mackinac Island, saying that the Island House property, or the modern-day Island House Hotel, granted the MRA permission for 4 months in the summer to train upwards of 6,000 people in its program. The Island House Hotel was derelict at the time and was recently seized by the state in 1939 due to tax delinquencies. Now, the MRA, having just been established in the US in 1941, were looking for a place to have large-scale conferences and also a place in the United States to train thousands of people in their program at once. And what better place to do it than a scenic island with tons of hotels and tourism? The MRA apparently renovated the Island House Hotel in exchange for its use, spending over $25,000 on repairs of the property. By the end of World War II, on September 2, 1945, the call to morally rearm nations was fully underway, especially after the US dropped the atomic bombs, and the MRA and Frank Buchman were only getting bigger, spreading to dozens of countries with over 1 million followers worldwide. It would seem that Buchman's practices combined with the plays that the MRA put on were quite effective. So effective that when Dr. Buchman invited a party of Swiss people to his conference on Mackinac Island in 1945, they found the MRA their global headquarters the next year, which was a former internment camp and eventual concentration camp during World War II that was about to be torn down, named the Coup Palace Hotel. This hotel was then renovated and would be the European base of operations for moral rearmament, with hopes that Mackinac Island could be the North American base of operations. The MRA continued spreading their name by putting on more theater productions, even making their own musical called Ideas Have Legs that was based off a book by a former English rugby player and journalist, Peter Howard. And this would bring thousands to auditoriums from Detroit all the way to Los Angeles, and drew even more American interest to their cause. After the summer of 1946, though, the Mackinac Island State Park Commission told the MRA that they would not be renewing their lease of the Island House property for another summer, saying that it was needed for accommodation of the traveling public and should not be rented for private group purposes. It seems that with the end of World War II, Mackinac Island tourism saw a modest uptick and needed all the hotels it could get, and the MRA was overcrowding the island. Also, some people on Mackinac Island weren't exactly on board with this group taking over a part of the island every summer. People wanted to have a peaceful vacation in one of the most beautiful parts of Michigan, and as we know, MRA members were often forced to try to convert others to their cause. So one could assume that many on the island were approached by people in the MRA to try to get them to join. Others were afraid that the MRA would expand too far on the island and did not want them to have power over local politics. So in that same year, Miles and Margaret Fillmore, who were both part of the MRA, bought the former Native American boarding school on Mackinac Island, Mission House. As I mentioned in the first part of this video, the Franks family had owned Mission House and ran it as a hotel until 1939, and when the hotel closed, the property sat vacant for 7 years until the Fillmores bought it in 1946. Miles Fillmore was a leader in the MRA and wanted to use Mission House as the base for the moral rearmament, with the Island House property now being in question. Miles was from London but had just married his bride Margaret, a native of Wheeling, West Virginia, on September 23, 1946 on Mackinac Island. And this would mark the first time an MRA member purchased land on the Mission Point side of the island. After finding no public use for the Island House Hotel though, the Mackinac Island State Park Commission would lend the Island House to the MRA from 1947 to 1950, before the MRA switched over to the Grand Hotel to hold larger conferences, with Frank Buchman coming to the island to celebrate his birthdays and speak at the conferences in 1951 and 1952. Post-World War II, it seemed that Buchman's ideas on Christian fascism had slowly changed the language of improving democracy. Buchman was still calling for a revolution though. During the 1951 Grand Hotel Convention, he exclaimed, quote, "If we can spread this revolution fast enough, we can save America and the world. Unless we have this revolution, there will be a revolution of chaos," unquote. By 1953, the Mackinac Island State Park Commission officially rejected the Moral Rearmament's request to buy the Island House Hotel, and this left Frank Buchman and the MRA reeling, as I'm sure booking a bunch of rooms at the Grand Hotel for their conferences was becoming quite expensive. The Park Commission's leader, a man named William Doyle, had fears that the MRA was going to try to take over Mackinac and would try to forego local taxes and bring automobiles onto the island. William Doyle had many powerful friends, as there was actually a bill passed in the Michigan Congress in 1953 to make it so the Mackinac Island State Park Commission was a permanent bipartisan board, only made up of Michigan residents. So no outsiders could take up a seat, and then the board could also name its own chairman, and many saw this as a move to thwart MRA power on the island. Frank Buchman would return again the next year for a World Assembly at the Grand Hotel in September of 1954, but this time, he was plotting much more than a speech. Buchman called this particular fall assembly the most important assembly of our time, but there might have been a bit more than hyperbole behind those words.
Our vision is that by December 1, 2, and 3
Unbeknownst to many, Buchman and the MRA were expanding their property on the far eastern end of the island. MRA members Miles and Margaret Fillmore already owned the old Mission House at Mission Point, and now the MRA was going to build a theater next to it, and eventually a gigantic conference and training center at Mission Point. A total of 1,029 people from 39 different countries attended the 1954 conference, and shortly after the conference ended, contractors broke ground on an 800-seat MRA auditorium at Mission Point on October 15th. A project they hoped to finish by Frank Buchman's birthday the following year on June 4th. The theater would be built right next to the old Mission House. Workers would stay over the winter to build the structure. The auditorium also would be a place to hold large meetings. It was designed by architect William Willett of Los Angeles, and much of the wood was 150-year-old Norway pine that came from nearby Bois Blanc Island and was floated down the straits to Mackinac Island in October before the water froze. When the water did end up freezing, workers would haul materials by a horse-drawn sled like Santa Claus. It was officially opened by May 15th the next year, just in time for the MRA's World Assembly on May 26th through June 5th. This time, 1,200 people attended the assembly, and plays would be held at the MRA Auditorium throughout the summer. And the development did not stop from there, as the MRA bought most of the adjoining Mission Point property around their auditorium. They hoped to build a great hall which would be a central location for the MRA North American headquarters, as well as dormitories for trainees and conference goers, smaller meeting rooms, dining halls, and eventually a film studio. But there was still one problem in the way: the Mackinac Island State Park Commission. It seemed that the MRA was still ruffling the feathers of the self-appointed King of Mackinac Island, William Doyle, as Moral Re-Armament wanted to use trucks to haul building equipment from British Landing to their spot on Mission Point. And the Mackinac Island State Park Commission did initially grant them emergency permission to use trucks on the island, as Mackinac Island had long had a no automobile law, and it takes permission to use automobiles on the island. But the MRA proceeded to say that they did not need permission from the commission to use the roads. More island residents shared in William Doyle's fears about the MRA taking over the island, changing the automobile law, and foregoing local taxes. Mackinac Island resident and general store businessman Francis Dowd, whose family owns Dowd's Market, the oldest family-owned grocery store in the United States, also said the amount of property the MRA bought does not equal the revenue they bring to the island. In a later 1966 article, it does seem that the MRA successfully avoided paying local taxes by claiming that it was a religious, educational, or charitable agency. On the other hand, the owner of the Grand Hotel, W. Stewart Woodfill, was more than happy to take MRA money for assemblies and was their loudest vocal supporter, along with many other Michigan politicians who believed their movement was a noble one. But Woodfill did tell the MRA members to stop lining up to sing to vacationers coming in on the ferries. The Mackinac Island City Council would end up meeting in October, and they voted to allow the MRA 1 month to use trucks on M185, the road from British Landing to Mission Point. The State Park Commission contended that they had jurisdiction over all state roads on the island, though, and after the MRA had already hauled 1,500 tons of gravel, the State Park Commission actually called state police to stop MRA trucks from hauling supplies to Mission Point, and went to the Ingham County Circuit Court to get an injunction against Moral Re-Armament. Initially, the MRA wanted to fight this injunction in court before they backed down and agreed to use horse-drawn carriages to haul their last 1,000 tons of gravel. And in the winter of 1955 to 1956, 160 construction workers from 43 Michigan communities and 7 different countries went to work on building a great hall and the initial dormitories of what we now know today as Mission Point Resort. The teepee-shaped main hall was built with red and white forest pine from Tequamatum Falls, but the building did not come without struggle. At one point, when the straits completely froze over and no barges could break through the thick ice on the Mackinac Straits, the construction workers had to be airlifted to the island. The Great Hall and dormitories almost weren't built that winter due to the allotted lumber running out, but when a cool Lake Huron wind blew some of the ice from the straits in March of 1956, construction workers rushed and hauled 100 more tons of lumber in a 24-hour span, using a barge to break through some of the remaining ice and using dynamite to explode other parts of the ice, as it was 36 inches thick. When island residents thawed out from their winter slumber, many had awoken to complain about construction workers using trucks and automotive vehicles to build the Great Hall. Some residents created a citizens' commission to complain about how Moral Re-Armament continued to use trucks over the winter, to which the MRA contended they only used trucks on their own property and not on state park roads. The State Park City Commission and City Council agreed that they weren't breaking any laws as long as they were using these trucks on their own property to build these complexes, and it never went beyond that. On August 24, 1956, Frank Buchman arrived to open up the new Moral Re-Armament Center, which architect William Willett called the first ideological training center to be built in North America. It could accommodate up to 1,000 people and would officially be the largest indoor space on Mackinac Island. But little did Frank Buchman and the MRA know, the following years were going to be the high point of the MRA's influence on Mackinac Island and the world. They'd end up building another dormitory in 1957 and would even build a film studio and soundstage that was completed by 1960 to achieve their dreams of breaking into Hollywood. This film studio was the second most productive studio in the US at one point, although none of their titles would exactly be considered modern-day classics or would have any lucrative box office success. But some of the biggest films were The Crowning Experience, Decision at Midnight, and Freedom. Long after Moral Re-Armament was gone, Somewhere in Time, starring Christopher Reeve and Jane Seymour, would film most of its scenes at the former MRA soundstage and film studio, with only a few exterior shots being filmed at the Grand Hotel. The Grand Hotel hosts a Somewhere in Time weekend once a year now. Exactly how much money and exactly how many followers the MRA had during this time is hard to tell, as according to a magazine article by Time and Tide in 1965, there is no official membership and there is no official organization. Also, there are finance committees which carefully allot the scarce money. Money that mostly seemed to have come in the form of gifts from business people and world leaders. They had 3,000 full-time volunteer workers that worked for them at their height. But also in this article, it notes that the MRA had the ear of leaders of Germany, France, India, Nigeria, New Zealand, and Japan, and they may have even had a hand in diplomacy between world powers. Some speculated that the organization was a front to fight communism, and in fact, many of their leaders preached anti-labor and anti-union sentiment. To say the least, much of their power was hidden in the shadows, and we may never know their true reach. But you really have to ask, what kind of effect did this group have on the people and the kids of those people when they had over 1 million followers who were constantly striving towards these unattainable absolutes, while their leader was openly preaching Christian fascist sentiment? The 1950s were so focused on the Red Scare and fighting communism in the United States and abroad, it seems that the MRA slipped through the cracks of many sociological studies, and their secrecy and cult-like ways kept them in the dark pages of history. And one has to ask, how did they affect Mackinac Island? Actress Glenn Close joined the organization when she was 7 and was raised under moral rearmament principles. Close would come out and openly call moral rearmament a cult. Close's dad, William Taliaferro Close, was once the personal physician to Congolese leader Mobutu Sese Seko, and while her dad lived in Congo, Close and her brother would live at MRA headquarters in Kuhl, Switzerland. She said they controlled every aspect of her life and constantly forced her to strive towards the unattainable four absolutes, and that she had much childhood trauma from growing up in the cult. According to a Time and Tide magazine article in 1965, Moral Rearmament's aim for young people was to do perfect work quickly and being able to keep on, and to have a dedication with a gay heart, the abandonment of our own desires and putting other people first. They also said that Christians should be infectious, and that if you are not winning people, you are sinning somewhere. Close would eventually break out of the MRA at the age of 22 in 1969 and become the star actress that she is today. Moral Rearmament's power would truly begin its downslide when Frank Buchman died in 1961 at the age of 83 of a heart attack. According to his New York Times obituary, he died in southern Germany, in the same Black Forest hotel in which, according to his writings, he conceived the idea of founding a worldwide movement for the spiritual improvement of mankind. He'd be buried at the Fairview Cemetery in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where he was raised and graduated college. Buchman was never married and never had any children. Author, former rugby player, and Buchman's right-hand man, Peter Howard, was not openly named the next leader of Moral Rearmament, but according to MRA spokespeople, he evolved. For much of the 60s, Moral Re-Armament would bring between 2,000 and 5,000 people a year to their training center on Mackinac Island to teach them how to strive towards the four absolutes. They charge adults $300 a training session and students $200 a training session, with each training session taking 3 weeks. At least 1,000 of these trainees would be college students or high schoolers, and there would be up to 4 training sessions each summer. Most of this training seems innocent enough, but you have to wonder, with the tenets of striving towards absolutes and perfections, how harmful were these training sessions? Peter Howard attempted to continue Buchman's work of expanding MRA's global power, but Howard would work himself into an early grave, passing away in 1965 at the age of 56 from a heart attack. Somehow all those years, Buchman and Howard kept the organization afloat despite a finance committee allotting most of the group's money. But when Peter Howard passed away in 1965, their financial troubles had already begun. In a last-ditch effort for the MRA to continue holding the property on Mackinac Island, they had one last idea, and that was to use the property for a college. It seemed that before Howard croaked, it was his dream to start a university at the property, not only as a pinnacle accomplishment for the global group, but also to recoup expenses from the property by deeding it to the college in the fall, winter, and spring months, when MRA training and events were not happening on the island. On the surface, it seemed like a good idea, and they had plenty of interest from others in the state. Legally, Mackinac College was a completely separate entity from the MRA, and the college had its own board of trustees, while the MRA had a board of directors. But 5 of the 18 Mackinac College trustees on the board were directors of the MRA, according to a Detroit Free Press article in 1966. Also, admissions officer W.E. Timothy Galway said that a quarter of the first freshman class of 150 students had been exposed to the MRA. Galway, the admissions officer, apparently had the idea to use MRA's show business sect to go to different schools and have 150 teenagers perform songs such as "You Can't Live Crooked and Live Straight." And these sing-outs were used as a recruitment tool to lure people into going to Mackinac College. The MRA also built a library for the college, naming it after Peter Howard. There was a sense on the island that with the college, Moral Re-Armament had begun the process of using their property for other purposes, rather than a training facility and North American headquarters. The self-appointed king of Mackinac Island, William Doyle, even said, "A little of the curse is off it," and that the MRA confined themselves to their own property. They didn't use our theater, they didn't use our restaurants, they didn't use our ice cream parlors, they didn't use our grocery store, they didn't use our carriages. They took over a number of properties that could have been used for tourists. The college could conceivably help the economy of the downtown area, that is, if they let the kids loose and don't regiment them as MRA has in past years. And with the beginnings of Mackinac College, also came the origins of Harvey the Ghost. One student of Mackinac College, falsely named Harvey but actually named Craig Kriebel, allegedly fell in love with a woman who left Mackinac College after a semester, but it was an unrequited love. The name of this woman is still not known today, but apparently Craig Kriebel was so heartbroken by this unrequited love that he went into the woods on Mackinac Island and unalived himself. A bad game of telephone eventually renamed Craig to Harvey, and islanders spread a story that he jumped off Robinson's Folly, the gigantic limestone bluff that towers over Mission Point. This story is a lie though, as confirmed by old newspaper articles of Craig's passing. Craig Kriebel actually was in the newspapers several times before his passing, one time in the Kalamazoo Gazette on August 30th, 1961, when he rode his bike from Kalamazoo all the way to Detroit. At 13 years old and 5'3" and 110 pounds, Craig apparently took 16 hours to do this bike ride and left his home with 6 sandwiches, salt pills, and a 10-gear bike. He'd end up completing this bike ride in one day, arriving at his sister's house at 8 p.m., a little saddle sore and undaunted. He apparently joined a local speed skating club in 1963 before riding his bike to Metro Detroit again in 1964. In this article where he rode his bike to Northville, it says that he first attended Portage High School in Michigan before his parents put him in a military academy in Pennsylvania. But by August of 1965, it seemed his mental health took a turn for the worse, as for some reason, he led police on a high-speed chase, burning rubber on I-94 at 100 miles per hour, while damaging 5 cop cars during the chase. He eventually got to Portage Township and drove over several lawns and knocked over mailboxes before abandoning his car on Lover's Lane Road and surrendering to police at 4 a.m. In February of 1966, Kriebel would plead guilty to assault with a dangerous weapon and await sentencing. Only 2 months after Kriebel pleaded guilty to assault with a dangerous weapon, that weapon being his car, Kriebel then stole a convertible from one of his Kalamazoo neighbors and drove it all the way to St. John's, Arizona with a 15-year-old boy before being apprehended and taken back to Kalamazoo. And by July of 1966, Craig would be sentenced to 6 months in jail for his high-speed police chase. But while he was in jail for his assault with a dangerous weapon charge, Craig would also plead guilty for stealing his neighbor's car. And this is where it gets a bit fuzzy, as Craig most likely would have been in jail until at least December of 1966, unless he was let out on good behavior. But the next newspaper clipping we get of him is when the police found his body in the Mackinac Island woods in July of 1967. Theoretically, Craig must have began attending Mackinac College in the winter semester of 1967. He had apparently been missing since February of that semester and wasn't found until July when some islanders were riding on horseback and saw his body in the woods with a rifle next to it. There was a search for Craig on February 11th, but it was called off because another student received a letter from Kriebel postmarked in St. Ignace. Craig told the student that he was leaving college and going back home. So this is where I question the idea that Craig unalived himself due to an unrequited love, as he had only been at the college for 1 month before he went into the Mackinac Island woods. As we see from his criminal history, he had been dealing with trouble for some time, and his parents had even put him in a military academy before this. It also seemed to reason that not many of the Mackinac College students would have known him by name, as he most likely would have only been there for a month at that point. Hence why a game of telephone turned Craig's name into Harvey, and the more poetic story of a heartbroken student named Harvey jumping off Robinson's Folly exists. Up to this day, vacationers at Mission Point Resort say that Harvey plays pranks on people at the resort, such as turning on and off lights, moving personal luggage around, and sometimes even appearing to women while they're alone in their room. The notion that a student was heartbroken after the crush had left Mackinac College after a semester is rooted in some truth, as many students would leave Mackinac College after only one semester. And it's no wonder why, as there was no internet in the 1960s and most of the shops and bars on Mackinac Island were closed in the winter. So these students were truly isolated at this MRA training center for the fall, winter, and spring, with nothing to do but entertain themselves in the brutal cold northern Michigan winters. With students continuously leaving Mackinac College and the school and MRA running out of money, Mackinac College would close in 1970, and Moral Re-Armament would sell the property that were once their North American headquarters in 1971, marking the end of an era on Mission Point. But the evangelical Christian ties to the property did not end there, as they sold the property to Ohio TV evangelist Rex Humbard. Humbard ran a Pentecostal church in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, that he called the Cathedral of Tomorrow, and Humbard was actually the first TV evangelist in the United States to have a weekly nationwide TV show that he also called Cathedral of Tomorrow that began in 1952. When Humbard bought the Mission Point property in 1971, he had the idea to turn it into a Christian ski resort and college, and by December of 1971, a ski complex was created at Mission Point that he called Mount Humbard. He also renamed the Moral Re-Armament Training Center to Rex Humbard Christian Development Center. According to the Mackinac State Historic Park's website, Mount Humbard had 2 ski runs, 2 jumps, a toboggan run, a skating pond, and cross-country trails. He named the ski runs Cain and Abel Ski Run and the cross-country trail Hallelujah Trail. Humbard called his new property the only island ski resort in the world. The Cathedral of Tomorrow spent millions in renovations and in constructing the ski resort, and the church also poured millions more into starting Mackinac College Part 2, including $1.6 million in promoting the college on the Cathedral of Tomorrow's TV and radio shows. The college again had a lot of trouble in attracting students, only attracting 140 students in the 1972 fall semester. Humbard was doing this while also building another complex in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, complete with a 500-foot tower. Apparently, since 1959, Rex Humbard sold $12 million in unregistered securities to his 4,000 church followers, according to the New York Times. And the Ohio Commerce Department and the Securities and Exchange Commission filed lawsuits and forced Humbard to close the college and divest his properties on Mackinac Island in 1973. Islanders would then call this chapter in the Mission Point story Humbard's Folly. By 1977, the Mackinac Hotel and Conference Center would turn it into a hotel for the first time in its history before selling it off to private ownership in 1987, where it would be officially renamed Mission Point Resort. And that is where Mission Point Resort still stands today. As for the MRA, the organization was already losing power for years after the deaths of Frank Buchman and Peter Howard. But when it closed its operations on Mackinac Island, it really ushered in the end of an era for the alleged cult. It would eventually rebrand itself as Initiatives of Change in 2001, and although its following would wane greatly over the end of the 20th century, it is still around today and holds yearly conferences at their European headquarters in Switzerland. What to make of this strange and bizarre tale? Was Moral Re-Armament a cult, and is the property and surrounding area haunted as so many claim today? Well, I'll leave that up to you to decide with the information I've given you, but I do think it's important to note that groups do not have to partake in mass Kool-Aid drinking or child abuse to be considered a cult. There are many cults in this world that seem innocent on the surface because they aren't as extreme as others, but nonetheless, they still emotionally abuse their followers. It's also important to remember that although Mackinac Island is one of the most beautiful places in the country, there's a great deal of dark history, colonization, Christian fascism, and exploitation that made it into the vacation spot that it is today. As I pointed out in my previous video where I covered the early history of Mission Point, this land was considered sacred to Native Americans, only for Europeans and Anglo-Americans to come in and push them off the land before putting the indigenous children into re-education schools and cornering the tribes onto reservations. Their ancestors are still buried here, and tourist shops and resorts have been built on top of their bones. Then when Moral Re-Armament came to the island, many of the trainees were forced to go through these training sessions and live life in ways that, to say the least, was not mentally healthy, and these people were most likely victims of mental abuse for years that may have been passed on to their children, creating a cycle of generational trauma. Frank Buchman himself was a Christian nationalist and openly spouted fascist sentiment that had a bigger impact on our country than we realize today. Does this history mean you shouldn't go to the island, buy some fudge, and enjoy yourself and take in the beautiful scenic views around Mackinac Island? No, I'm not saying that, but please remember that history is often a dark and complex tale that creates and still affects the world we're in today, and those tourist shops and resorts along Lake Huron do not exist without the suffering that countless others went through before. And maybe, if the opportunity ever arises, support the indigenous people of northern Michigan and across the country after everything they've went through.